Yeah, that's, I guess, a tension of, and we're seeing this now across the country, because this story in the education sector opened up in the 1990s, became absolutely central as, we produce the RTE. So the para teacher or the paraprofessional in the health system. But again, the challenge there is somebody doesn't necessarily have the full, within quotes, educational qualification, and then they're recruited as a para something or the other. They want to enter the workforce, and they start agitating relatively quickly to become part of the state establishment. And then the question is, okay, if they are in the state establishment, how do you raise their capacities to do what they're doing, even though they may want to stay where they are? So and that of course is tied to the other question of entitlements. And that is, we have a framework of entitlements like the right to education or the right to food or whatever it is, and then the parameters of delivering the outcomes in that with the way the people actually don't match. So we're unable to deal with this question of examinations, as you say, where the people would like to be and stay, and where the outcomes have to be delivered with higher expectations from the communities that you're delivering services to. So how does one square that circle?
Yeah, I think partly where local communities, where services are to local communities, other than the executives, say of a Zilla Parishad or whatever, I think it's very important that they absolutely not be state level employees. That is really imperative. The hiring, the salaries, the firing should be at the local level. The para teacher, the para healthcare personnel, the training systems can be at the state level, right? Because you will not have that capacity. The state can augment the resources of local governments. But, when a person lives in a particular place, she or he has much greater accountability, because every day, if you don't show up to teach the kids, you're living there, right?
Yeah.
But if you come by a motorcycle from 20 kilometers away, you don't show up for a week, it's very hard, because there's no sense of shame. And, these things matter. There are social norms involved as well, not just formal institutional structures.
No, absolutely agreed there. I mean, in fact, I think the education sector is a classic example where now 90% of the teacher education capacity is in the private sector, right? And especially after COVID, you find that at least half the population has gone back into, government schools, especially because of other schools that are there. So you have this mismatch where now, in theory, as you're saying, the service delivery on the the teacher education side is private, but they're coming into public employment. And yet there is this huge gap, because the quality of people who are trained in the private sector is still not good enough, and it's not raising people's capacities or the quality of education in some senses. So I mean, this is an interesting kind of phenomena where we're still not able to make those linkages. Or even the ASHA worker issue, right? The ASHA workers is the cutting edge of what happened in terms of COVID. We wouldn't have been able to handle their vaccination programs without them. But their aspiration is to become a government employee, right?
No, I mean, in India, everyone's aspiration is to become a government employee, because who would not want a job where, in principle, you get higher salaries, you have job security, and you have a pension system, which is, which we tried to change, as you know, and we struggled very hard and did manage in the early 2000s. And now, due to populist politics, we're trying to go back to the old system, which basically is actually a very, very, in our work, what we show is what these pension systems are. They are very inequitable, not just in a cross section, but over time, because you're essentially borrowing from future generations to pay for the current generation, right? Yeah. And Arumar, if I may, I think in all of this, I think the saddest part of our system, because this is something I've been working on for many years, is our entire education system. I mean, whether it is at the university level or at, school level, I think we have fundamentally failed our children. And the children in any society are the most unprotected, the most helpless segment of a population. And a society which treats its children with such, you know, in such
Callousness.
a poor way, such callousness, that's the right word, I think is a society that is undoubtedly risking its own future.
Mhm. No, I wouldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's exactly what we try and do here at IHS and many other colleagues in the room to try and address that question. But the fact is, I mean, there's this impression that the Indian state is sort of very large, very bureaucratic, and it's kind of, at one level people perceive it as being overstaffed. Actually, it's deeply understaffed, but in the wrong places. I guess one of the questions that you struggled with just now is, today we had Dr. Balasubramaniam, who's a member of the Capacity Building Commission, and he was giving us a very interesting perspective of how the Prime Minister sees capacity development as a core way of getting to a 5 trillion economy. Essentially moving 3 million people who are in central government and other such things from being just karamcharis into karamyogis, etc. But I guess, I mean, these are wonderful things to talk about, and they're trying to do many things in that space. How can you reconcile, these contradictions with sort of mantras like minimum government and maximum governance? How do we bridge this gap between the aspiration of, and it's not only, every government is trying to do this. In the 90s, in the early 2000s, they started with a grand program of trying to restructure and reorganize and re-incentivize the bureaucracy at various levels. Some states have succeeded, but at the national level, I would say we've still got a long way to do. So how does one kind of bridge this question of like you said, staffing and functioning of the state machinery to move from inputs to outputs happening in some places, but certainly not to outcomes? Because people are demanding outcomes just now. And hence, we're giving them SOPs, direct benefit transfers, and subsidies. That's hardly an outcome. Fine, it's saying you survive on your own. We'll just sort of support it through other means rather than through improved service delivery. So, what are the lessons we can learn from some parts of India, other parts of the world, of how you can deal with these questions?
Look, over the years, I've struggled with this question, and I think that fundamentally, it's less about formal procedures and rules, or I'm saying not just about formal procedures and rules, but a set of norms of self-restraint. And by that, I mean, look, the Prime Minister obviously has very, is good intentions in thinking about, improving state capacity. He recognizes that there is a problem. But the fact is, this government has chosen to have many vacancies because it wants bureaucrats who meet a test of loyalty. If you're going to put loyalty way before competence, and you define loyalty in narrow terms, well, you have already sort of self-sabotaged your broader goals, right? Because, good people will not join if they always have to look over their shoulders in what they're doing, right? They always have to look over their shoulders lest they say something, which will be seen as critical of the powers that be, right? So having a certain overall tolerance for dissent, for criticism, that's a norm. You can't put it as a rule, right? And if you do not have that capaciousness, it's just hard to recruit teams, because fundamentally, I think we still haven't got this into our system. Talent will always have options. And in the past decade plus, Indian talent has global options.
That's true.
right? And if we see our universities, that's a classic example, right? As Indian universities deteriorated, the rate at which young Indians go to study abroad, the way in which our scientists go abroad, it's unprecedented. It's not new, by the way. It's going on for the past 50 years. As you know, I work on Indian migration.
Yeah.
I mean, India is the only country that is so proud that it has its best scientists outside the country. And they never ask the question, why are they outside and not in the country?
Of course, we celebrate the diaspora significantly because the diaspora seems to contribute to what's happening inside the country also, both functionally, economically, and politically also. So, I mean, at least there is that hope of doing that. No, but I mean, you're right about that. But I guess the core question still remains. There are some states in the country. So while this may be partially true for some elements of the center, there are some states, there's a divergence in some senses in state performance. So 10 years or 15 years ago, you wouldn't imagine that Odisha would be able to do the things that it's doing just now, right?
True.
Or in some senses, what UP has been able to do dramatically in some sectors would have been completely unthinkable for people like you and myself who've spent time and lived there and seen things that are there. So there are things that are sort of the counter trends that are happening in some ways. So what are the things that sort of have enabled that kind of process? Is it the political economy? Is it finding the right people who are technocratically oriented? Or just getting their sort of incentives right, or being able to align local governments with what the state government is doing? Why do we see this convergence and divergence happening at state level?
One is, I think, Orissa, I think, is a fascinating example because you have a longest serving chief minister who's actually quite invisible. Right? I mean, he's the biggest political paradox in the country in many ways. His Uriya is not good either. And yet, I think clearly, however, political stability, and he doesn't fear that there is someone there out to oust him. The factionalism that you see in so many other states, right? There's always a guy seeking to unseat you.
Yeah, from your own party, not necessarily
exactly.
From
I mean, yeah, you're not worried about the opposition. You're worried about those near you. And that's same with sort of Yogi Adityanath, right? I mean, nobody doubts, that. So ironically, and to some extent, some good things, relatively speaking, only are happening in Bengal too. I follow it a bit, and look, I'm not saying these are great, but I'm just saying in a relative sense, right? But where at the state level, there's no doubt that when you have coalitions, or as you know, with the Congress, or we saw with the BJP in Karnataka, right? There were all these factions, all of that. And you had a terrible government in your state. I mean, there's no two ways about it, right? So I think that political aspect is really very, very important. Without that stability, then everyone has to be bought off to retain their support, because today ideology is a very, very weak glue holding political parties together. What is holding them together, at least at the state level, is the fishes and loaves of office.
No, absolutely so. But then the question then is, as the line blurs between political parties and their cadres and actual officialdom, as you were talking about, this alignment with people who are both loyal and committed in some senses in all spaces, in the executive, potentially now in the judiciary, etc. How does one kind of, I mean, how, some states have performed quite differently. Tamil Nadu, irrespective of which political party is in place, tends to deliver. Of course, they use a lot of populism in some senses, but if you go to Tamil Nadu, I was there just last couple of weeks or so, they have a framework in place, and the entitlements actually work. Delivery actually happens. And if you're able to access it through whatever means, either through caste mechanisms or otherwise, you're able to sort it out. And they are quite conscious of the fact that they need to reorganize their their state cadres, and they're actually building sometimes from bottom up. So apart from the political questions, that what are the incentives inside, and what are the really interesting things that we've seen happening inside the bureaucracy that have enabled this to change? And is it individuals? Is it? I mean, do you require a station to set up and change something, and then a set of successes to maintain that, or is it a combination of of political leadership, like mission-driven stuff, which has happened, let's say, in states like Madhya Pradesh, sometimes in Rajasthan, etc. What is this sort of the connection, or let's say the chemistry between the political class and the bureaucracy that seems to work in some places?
So I remember my reading is that the reason, as you know, till around 1980, at least definitely till 1970, UP and Bihar were regarded as having better bureaucracies.
Mm-hmm.
And UP per capita income till I know for till 1960 was higher than Tamil Nadu and Andhra.
Yeah.
Right. So I think the key thing that made this possible in the South before the North is that the social revolution occurred there first.
Mm-hmm.
Kerala, we know, but also to Tamil Nadu, right? And the intensity of the caste sort of conflict in the North, and Bihar, UP are classic examples.
Yeah.
It plays itself out in the bureaucracy massively, right? So that when a bureaucracy is disunited from within, it's much harder to make it, right? Because anything you do is seen through a caste lens. It always has this distortionary,
orientation, or yeah.
Exactly. And frankly, I think I do see that, as we saw with Bihar, right? Under Lalu, you see this reaching a crescendo.
Absolutely.
But gradually, I think, and one of the things that I've been doing is that if you look at the intensity of caste conflict in UP and Bihar, it's definitely declined relative to what it was in the 80s and 90s.
Yes, the contest of certainly declined. Yeah.
Right. I'm not saying it's not there, but I'm saying relatively speaking, right? And so one plausible hope is that as that declines, right, the ability and willingness of the bureaucracy to act as a relatively more cohesive force, and therefore be able to deliver rather than being caught in internecine warfare, is likely to improve. And I think some of what you're seeing in UP perhaps points to that. I want to be cautious because I'm not sure, but it's at least a plausible hypothesis.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that the so-called OBC mobilization and revolution has, in a sense, taken over. I mean, let's say the BDOs of UP, because if you just look at the BDO card in UP, or today we were just talking about the police in UP, the number of policemen in UP is more than the entire civil service in Haryana, or maybe even in Gujarat. The scale is it's like a country like Europe. It's like taking the entire and if you have a fragmented kind of structure that's which of course has basic conditions of poor pay, promotions, transfers are all over the place. Given to patronage politics and all that kind of stuff, work conditions are horrible. Then maybe the caste consolidation actually is something that maybe sometimes useful in some senses, right? Or
I mean, it needed to work itself out, right? I mean, there was no doubt on the upper caste like hegemony in UP and Bihar, and that had to be undercut. And it was not going to be undercut in any voluntary way, right?
Fair enough. No, I hear you saying. So, rather than going, of course, the ancient story was going back to Bhutan and whatever it is. And then Hegde tried other stuff in Karnataka around decentralization and, moving power around that way. So you're saying that the political engagement is very critical, and that plays itself in the bureaucracy. So, just doing sort of structural or institutional changes in dealing with the classic things that you do in organizational design, pay, promotions, transfers, work conditions, all that kind of stuff. That has, or even doing sort of modernization, which is functional roles, responsibilities, and whatever, changing the ACR rules, etc. Those things have a lesser impact than who the people are and what their identities are.
I agree. I think, in fact, I think we, the work I've done with, BDOs, as you know,
Yeah.
We found that, it's not the case that they are lazy or inept or don't work hard. Many of them work sincere and work hard, all of that. The average vacancy rate in a BDO's office, the model in India, is about 40%. And as you know, we created more and more central schemes that went through BDO's offices. And many of the people who designed them didn't think through, look, we are asking that same office to do more and more tasks. Are we equipping it and giving it adequate resources commensurate with those tasks?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is particularly no, and you have siloing even if it's there. Look at the health program that's siloed along, all the verticals, etc., etc. I mean, to tie in with the earlier discussion we had that said, we have tried to use mission mode processes. So, I mean, you said, okay, exit, we can entry, but you don't exit. So then if you design missions in theory allow you to go in, achieve the mission, and then exit. Of course, bureaucracies kind of try and maintain the status quo and maintain themselves in some senses. So many states, or even the government of India actually, has used mission-led approaches to try and address this question. So you're in theory allowed exit, but the story on missions have been also quite mixed. So
yeah, so I mean, I could be mistaken, but so the mission mode at the center at least started first in Rajiv Gandhi's government.
Yeah, I've seen that with my own eyes at that time of the Prime Minister.
Right. There were these 5 missions, I think, telecom, immunization,
water.
Actually, yeah, water, illiteracy.
Yeah.
And I think edible oil.
Yeah, and Operation Black Ball.
Yeah. And as you know, the drinking water perhaps now is getting, with this Har Ghar Mein Jal mission, finally, we are a long way on sort of illiteracy. Telecom was really solved by technology, not, later on.
Change. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think mission mode for something, you could think of, there's something you can think of a national campaign for X, right?
Like polio.
Right, where we feel that every child has to be immunized, right? But I think while doing that mission, one has to put in the systems, because immunization is not a one-off process, right? The next generation of children have to be immunized. Are you sure you've built in the cold chains, the vaccine, production capacity, all the systems? So I think something like the oil seeds mission, where if it is about raising and creating new seeds and technologies, that can be one-off. But things like health and education, they simply can't be one-off. There have to be continuous processes.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a sense, what we've tried to do is to disguise the delivery of everyday frontline implementation as a series of missions, and hope that because you have sort of pockets of competence that will carry it out, and then you can tick off what needs to get done. And obviously some states are better than others in doing that, and hence you have sort of unequal delivery as far as that's concerned. So I mean, that's an interesting kind of way to try and explain what has happened and what could happen in some senses.
Umar, if I may, I think the one puzzle in these is we focus so much on the supply side, but not much on the demand side, right? There was all this thing on Punjab farmers, that whole stir, right? And, we, could I sort of disagreed with the stir, but anyway, let's say there was collective action, right?
Mhm.
And it worked. When is the last time you have seen that on health and education?
Yeah, you've seen only people trying to get jobs as parateachers or
Yeah.
as health workers, etc.
But it's not that I want to make sure the teacher shows up and is doing a good job, like for my child, and otherwise that teacher should be fired.
Yeah.
Right? Communities simply do not organize because our politicians do respond like to voters.
Mhm.
But the puzzle really is why is there so little collective action on the behalf of voters on issues that are fundamental to their lives and their children's lives?
So in a sense, what I hear you saying is that even our political process of mobilization is episodic. It happens during the election, it's forgotten in between. There's no active pressure that's there, or even if it does, it works through patronage networks. So there's no actual, push for accountability, delivery and services in some senses. There's an expectation, but there's no push for it.
Right. And I think this is where civil society is also, right? Civil society organized itself around NREGS, if you remember.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And the Right to Food Act.
Yeah, and right to information before that.
Exactly. But it has never organized itself around health and education.
Or water for that matter.
Right. I mean, I'm not, we did have the right to education, but we didn't really go down at the local level rather than just a bill, right?
Yes, absolutely. So same thing for water and even housing, which we work on. That's not something that's obvious. Housing has now come as an entitlement and extension of patronage. Of course, it's the same thing now. Mission mode. Right. I want to give everybody a house by X, Y, and Z because it makes good sense. But you're right. The demand side is not as strong as it could be. So what I may hear you say is that, there's this question of trying to enable citizens to get better services, but actually there's also the political mobilization of citizens in whatever form it may be. It may be through political parties, it may be through movements in some cases, in other cases, it may be through civil society, that there is a gap in, or maybe we are still a fairly, an early fledgling democracy in that sense. You don't see the kind of, the kind of mobilization that you see in other parts of the world, including in some parts of Africa around these questions. So it
is. I remember I grew up in Calcutta and the CPM would have massive rallies against apartheid, against US imperialism, but it would not have a single rally on the fact that the CPM unions would not show up to work at all.
Yeah. Good. That's an interesting point to maybe open up the conversation for questions. So Aishwarya, if people in the room, we have another 15-20 minutes or so. We can open up the conversation or we can keep talking. Devesh and I can keep talking for a long while, but I think maybe we should take some questions from people who are online or otherwise. Yeah.
There's a question here in the room.
Sure.
Devesh, really it was opening for us actually. This after all these sessions, I was like thinking what would be there now. My name is Murli and I am from an organization called Nammanima Cycle Foundation, where we are trying to promote cycling and walking infrastructure in cities and towns. So currently you said every day it is like waste management or something, right? Cycling, they have to build the infrastructure, clean the infrastructure, ensure that we can reuse the next day, right? So today, pedestrian path, like because I know some minister, I try to push and some things happen. I'm not saying things don't happen only, because I stay in an IS officer only and I know many of these IS officers, and sometimes some policy gets executed. What I see is next 3 months, they have built a cycle track investing 6 crores or something. There is no maintenance or something like that. So active mobility is where people's health will improve and the society comes together. As you said, with the car-based center, everybody is in one direction. There's no convergence happening. With active mobility, we feel people will come together and they can discuss on what the things. So any insights with all your research, how do we kind of like make the state prioritize active mobility kind of thing is what I would like to hear from you, so that health is improving, our pollution cities become more livable, and children get a better future is what I think. So I would like to get your insight. Thank you very much.
So Murli, I'm sure you know much more about this than I do. Uh, but you raised a question which really has been bothering me for many years, is why can't we just have good footpaths in our towns and cities, right? It's not expensive. It's most low income people in towns, they walk. In any case, as you said, it's good for your health. We can spend hundreds of thousands of crores on the National Highway Authority, but our local governments will not just do the most basic civic thing, because a footpath is the most essential public space in any town or city, and I just don't have a good answer like for you. Maybe Haromer might be able to, because I know he's been thinking about these, because, is it that our local governments lack imagination? I really think today, unlike say 20 years ago, many local governments do have financial resources, or they can find the financial resources, right? So maybe Haromer, you can help us out. Why something as basic, simple for improving urban life? No one is fundamentally opposed. There's no vested group that says we will not allow footpaths, right? So why is it just an imagination?
Well, it's partially the imagination of people who spend a lot of their time in cars, like Murli is saying, right? I mean, if you spend your time in the car, then the footpath is less important as far as that's concerned. You just don't notice it. And the people who call for tenders and manage processes, often drive in cars. So let's say if the counterfactual to that is in cities that have more resources. So if you take Delhi, for example, the NDMC now has a regular process. Whenever the government changes, the footpaths also change. Because so there is a political economy of actually making that happen.
But Arumar, here I'm thinking of the small towns.
Yes, exactly. So in the small towns, part of the challenge, of course, is the question of what is the public space and what is not, and who can colonize it, whether it's the poor or the rich. And I mean, the classic story, to go back to Kolkata, has been the footpaths of Kolkata from 71 onwards. That was, so the question of what is public, what is private, who controls that, and the footpath is not only a question about the engineer who makes the footpath. It's also about the the police and other systems.
Right.
That is an active space for both rent seeking and squatting. So it's a contest between different sets of people in that space. Apart from the people who walk, and the footpath is not just a space for walking; it's a space to reside, to do work, and what is legal and what is not legal. There is a central question. So, for example, I would say, in answer to Murli Singh, of course, you're looking at the cycling, fine, that's very important, but the footpath is very critical to that, because if you don't have the footpath, you have no place that you can cycle next to. Number one. Number two, as far as as a whole range of people are concerned, the big gains that that happened maybe 10 years ago was that vendors, just vending zones became part of an act. There was a whole movement to create the Street Vendors Act, which actually creates space for street vendors in some senses. So we don't have a mobilization of people on cycling, and the cyclists typically get wiped out by people in cars. So it's also a political question in that sense. Right? The cars are congested. Every time, we've tried let's say in many cities, the BRT systems have not worked. Not again because of the cyclists, it's because the car folks don't want to have their travel from their place of residence, like he's saying, to the places where the newspaper offices are in Delhi, be interrupted. So I think this is an elite question at one end, plus it's a political economy question of who controls public space. In some ways, it's a little bit more subtle than
Right.
Can I rework the plan, etc. on that? But yes, it's a ridiculous question. Fine, this is a simple one. It's like water. Why is it that we don't have public fountains everywhere? We used to have them in every city, every small town, 30 years ago. So now, even if you're very poor, you have to buy, or you have to find a
Right.
a plastic bottle to drink from. It's a public good in some sense. It should be available. It doesn't cost very much. It doesn't
Right.
certainly waste a lot of water, a lot less than somebody who is better endowed and wants to have a shower and spend 10 times that amount. It's not a big deal to do that, but we don't do it. Fine. So it's I guess it's a question of class. It's a question of the orientation of the bureaucracy, and I think the courts have never stepped into this space. I mean, I haven't seen a single activist judgment on footpaths
Right.
and cycle pathways.
Because the judges only use cars.
Yes, of course. So I think Murli is trying to get chief ministers. If he can get the judges to use cars and get smoked out in some places, get off their cars and use cycles, it might change a bit.
The day we insist that our elites have to walk, that day you will get good footpaths.
Yes, absolutely. There's another question in the chat, Devesh, which basically says, how do we leverage PRIs to develop more capacities and capability of civil servants? As PRIs are decentralized and they act more locally. So, how can we mobilize that? And what's the experience on that? Of course, maybe I should take it in two parts. One is the PRI question. And the second question is the ULB question, especially in a country that's becoming more urban. And delimitation now is going to start maybe changing that. So any questions on, any responses on that context?
See, I think again, this is something you know much better than I do, but I think the urban story is really risking becoming one more of our missed opportunities. In our work, we show that we are so locked into thinking that farmers are the big heroes and everything has to be done for farmers. We are forgetting that in the process, we are locking them into agriculture, which simply cannot give them the types of incomes because of the sheer small sizes of plots. Interestingly enough, one of Ambedkar's most well-known papers in economics exactly on this in 1918, where he pointed out that the only future of Indian farmers is to move out of farming.
Exactly. Any farmer. We know, I work with farmers also in various parts of the country. Very, very few people would want their children, unless they're very large farmers, to inherit their
Exactly.
farms. They know it doesn't work.
Right.
It's in a very bad shape. Yeah. In spite of the 140 million tons we produce.
Exactly. And so, but that pull factor of urban, which would have been normally in other countries at similar stages of development, would have been factories. That, of course, has not occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And in part because we have made urbanization a much more difficult process.
Yeah.
And part of the reason is that, look, for politicians, see, wealth is in urban areas. So to capture that wealth, you need to make sure you control urban areas. So it doesn't matter which political party, right? It does not want to give any serious weight to the 74th Amendment, right? One of the things we've just put together data on property taxes in India. India is a real outlier.
Absolutely.
In how small, just how small property taxes.
Yeah.
And in principle, Bangalore should not be getting any money from the Karnataka government. It should be way more than self-sufficient in resources for it to develop, be able to borrow all of that. But it is also, many states do not allow their municipalities to raise property taxes.
Exactly. Our direct tax regime at the local level is like, forget about discipline, it doesn't exist.
Exactly.
And the indirect tax regime has grown much more drastically, and the redirection doesn't happen, even by rules.
And even so that the more an entity is financially dependent on a higher level of government, the less it will have political autonomy, right? There was the great Italian public sector reformer who became the head of the European Union, Romano, Prodi.
Yeah.
Yeah, he once had a line that financial autonomy is key to political autonomy, right? So for our ULBs, if they don't have their own stronger tax bases, and they also are, even our Panchayat Raj, they simply do not want to impose higher property taxes, right? So unless we move to systems of greater financial capacity, the financial dependence on states will allow state governments and the state political executive to really shape the politics, the sort of urban processes. Because as we know, the key thing is to make sure that you capture land and property, because that's where there is big money.
Absolutely, and that's what drives the political machines in most places. In fact, I mean, one of the things that KC has kind of always ruled in some senses, because was that they didn't make the 12 sort of devolved functions under the 73rd Amendment. They should. It's just a comma and shall rather than should.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a critical political juncture between whatever 61st and the 73rd that never happened, and 30 years later we're still in the same place, because
and that's why, as you know, many states have really tried to sabotage their own state finance commissions.
Yeah, exactly, absolutely. So,
right?
Yeah,
they don't set them up. Their reports are accepted after 3 years. By that time, the time has passed, etc., etc.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the small victories that we have was to try to convince the 15th Finance Commission that the devolution to local bodies should be based on the population base. So they've actually done that. So
Right.
now, there's a correction because the 2011 census didn't happen, but there's a moving correction that will move year by year in terms of devolution to ULBs based on that. So I mean, that's a kind of very simple thing.
Right.
But yeah, you're absolutely right that both in terms of imagination and the politics, we're working in the wrong end. So if you don't have the resources, you can't have the autonomy. If you don't have the autonomy, you can't have the right people. And you can't get the the kind of talent you want to, which brings us back to where the argument was. You cannot build state capacity without the political will to make that happen. The sort of funds, functions and functionaries which come with both of the political will and the functioning, let's say. There's another question in the chat, and I think this is probably the last question we're going to take, which basically says, so we have basically agriculture, industry, and services, the three core sectors. And now we're talking about a fourth and a fifth type of economy that is about education and decision making. I'm not sure that's completely true, but so the question is, can capacity development actually make a difference? I mean, I'm trying to interpret it here to the services sector rather than just dealing with the agrarian sector or the industrial sector. Is will state capacities make a significant difference to the services sector? I may be taking this very not very accurately, but the question is not so precise.
We have a couple more questions here.
Oh, you have a couple more questions. So let's pick up the questions and let Devesh respond to all of them together. Thanks, Aishwarya.
So, Devesh, my name is Ritesh. I have a thought followed by a question for you. So if we start India's journey from 1992 with the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment, so we see that that's not scalable in all the states. I mean that, so if that's a bigger umbrella, when we come down to states, so there is a customization, not standardization of that. So what's applicable in Gujarat may not be applicable in Mizoram. Okay, so is the thing right that standardization is not possible and the India's current problems can be solved with customization? Point one. And when you spoke about local governments have been very weak always, true. Then why don't we have a bottom-up approach? Rather, we still follow a top-down approach. So where the problem lies?
Okay, good. One question. What's the next question, Aishwarya? Aishwarya, is there another question from the floor?
Hi, Devesh, hi, this is Anupriya here. I just want to circle back quickly to the comment that you left, like why so little collective action? That question being because that in a way becomes significant in putting pressure on political will and thereby kind of like being able to deliver service better. But this question has been stuck with me for some time now also. Why, because mostly like apart from the political mobilizations that happen during elections, there aren't really much of a larger scale movement that has been happening at the regional levels, mainly, for instance. And I'm specifically speaking to the users of primary health cares or primary school educations or, the actual service, more like the participant, and the word used, of these government institutions aren't really kind of creating that mobilization. Some of these, even though they try to, they do get disintegrated very fast due to other personal interests, or they may tend to see an alternative in the private sector, or there is also this trend of providing charity, or certain groups kind of like giving out like freebies in sense, not from the government institutions, but other places. Do you think this is in a way creating the potential, like diluting the potential for people to mobilize or to come together? Because there needs to be some kind of an emotion that brings people together to actually hold people accountable. So these recent trends have been kind of like very much on charities and the other philanthropies. That's instead of facilitating this process, ends up becoming like the direct players to actually providing the needs or something that is immediately met. Yeah.
Thanks. I think Devesh will pick up. So basically 3 questions. One on collective action and mobilization. The second question on top down versus bottom up, and how that sits with the decentralization question. And the third one was was about whether capacity development can help potentially lead a service sector led economy. Okay, that's quite a range, but yeah, we can.
Let me start with Aishwarya's on collective action. What's that? There's that Hindi saying, "Jaisi praja vaise raja." And in a sense, maybe this is the society we have. We all want to blame and dump on the state. And we don't want to ask hard questions about Indian society itself. See, today in any state in India, right? Imagine if something happened untoward to a particular statue. Somebody put disfigured a statue or did something to a place of worship, or there was a language thing, there would be massive protests, right? You can get collective action very much on symbolic issues, but very hard to get on substantive issues. So if a society is so susceptible to symbolism on cultural/religious issues, then we have to ask hard questions about that society itself. Why is that the case? Right? There's nothing that prevents, right, that if your own child is not being immunized, if your own child is getting terrible education, you're unwilling to mobilize. But the moment something, some hero of your caste has been so-called, a film has been made where they are not seen as the biggest heroes, you're ready to throw stones and go out on the streets. And we know that's the case all over the country. This is not specific to one group or the other. And for that, I frankly don't have a good answer for you, because other than to say that we don't want to ask hard questions of the nature of Indian society itself, because the state is not independent of society, right? For better, worse, in very imperfect ways, it is a reflection of the society.
Yeah, this goes to the heart of Ambedkar's writings and work.
Exactly.
This question 100 years ago and onwards. Yeah.
So on that, I think my only hope is that civil society, and as we know that many of the activists always saw the answer in the state, right? That you pass some bill, you pass some law, and we think we've achieved our goals. they themselves have to ask the questions that, India has enough laws for anything and everything. The law is not the crucial constraint. And the implementation of that requires civil society bringing collective action at local and state levels. And that's a harder sell. On the first question on capacity building, look, for sure, if you, building capacity is like training, augmenting human capital. In and of itself, it's a good thing, but it's definitely not sufficient, right? We know, right, that many IAS officers go abroad to be trained, and they go and learn something, they do a 2-year program and get expertise in, say, health. And then the guy is put in charge of archives when he comes back. Well, the capacity is there, but if you are not sort of having a career path for your employees, that if they are trained in X, we should place them in places where you can use the skill they've been trained on, it's useless. The training will be irrelevant. In fact, you'll get a very frustrated sort of officer. So we need both training, but we need to really think much harder on the assignment problem. On the second question, look, I don't think we should think of this as a binary on top-down versus bottom-up. There will be some issues, taxation is an issue where you will always need top-down. No society wants to tax itself. They would love others to be taxed. And a property tax can only work in India, frankly, if it's part of coming from the national level, because it will not, Bangaloreans are not going to vote that please increase our property tax. That's not going to happen, right? So on some issues, you will need a top-down. But I think on public service delivery, for sure, you need very much a sort of bottom-up approach, because it's really, it's your surroundings, it's the services that affect you very much at a local level, and that must be placed, the onus of organizing it, delivering it, holding functionaries accountable, that should be much more at a local level. Harun, I'm not sure if I've answered everything.
No, you've done very well. And I'm sorry we've run 5, 6 minutes, 7 minutes over. So thanks so much. And sorry, folks, that we ran over a little bit. But yeah, it's been a very interesting and useful conversation. These are core questions. And we have a lot of people from different parts of the country and from the city, trying to engage with how we can build this. Because of late, there is at least some orientation that we have to try and reorient public institutions, build their capacities, and try and align these kind of, simple common sense kind of things, but we've succeeded to not do that for sometimes 30, 40, 50 years that we've been watching the system. So thanks a lot, Devesh. And thanks a lot, folks. Great.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Devesh. Thank you, Aru.